Welcome to WITA's Friday Exchange, a media product of the Washington International Trade Association. Each week, we bring you inside the room with former trade negotiators and policy insiders to unpack the latest in trade and tariff developments, what's been announced, what's at stake, and what might come next. Imagine our speakers are sitting at a local pub after a tough week at the office or at the negotiating table, downloading with their colleagues about the latest developments in international trade. That's what we aim to bring you with WITA's Friday Exchange. New episodes drop every Friday. Subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify to be the first to know when they go live. On this week's podcast, we're going to try to unpack one of the thorniest issues in U.S. and global trade policy, trade with India. We touched on some of the India issues 3 weeks ago in our podcast on the WTO and multilateral trade. But we realized that trade issues and negotiations with India deserve its own podcast, given how sticky some of those issues seem to be for, honestly, generations of trade negotiators. We're recording this week's episode on Thursday, October 2nd at 1 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time. So depending on when you download and listen, the trade issues we discussed today may have changed. Welcome today to four people with battle scars from negotiating trade issues with India. Don Shackleford with Looking Glass Trade LLC, former executive director for trade agreements, policy, and negotiations at the Department of Commerce, and a former assistant USTR for WTO and multilateral affairs. Sharon Bomer-Lauritsen with Ag Trade Strategies and the former assistant USTR for agricultural affairs, among other positions she's held. Mark Linscott, Senior Advisor at the Asia Group, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and the former Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for South and Central Asian Affairs, and a former Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for WTO and Multilateral Affairs. And our moderator and discussion host today, Joe DeMont, Chair of International Trade Policy and Global Life Sciences at Crowell Global Advisors, and the former Acting Assistant USTR for Asia and the Pacific. Joe?
Thank you, Ken, and hello, Don, hello, Mark, hello, Sharon. Looking forward to this discussion today on India. I thought maybe it would be best if we started with some level setting, some context setting, and just looking at this year to start off with. Earlier this year, I think everyone will remember, there's a lot of hope and ambition in U.S.-India trade negotiations. India got a quick start with this administration. There was talk early that they would be concluding a full agreement by around now, this fall. But in the event, it's been a difficult time. There's been a lot of ups and downs, difficult substantive issues. There's been a broadening of issues when President Trump added additional tariffs in August. They announced them in August for Indian imports of Russian oil. And at the end of all of this, India ends up with a 50% tariff, one of the highest in the world. From the administration. So let's unpack this a little bit. But let's do this maybe by starting at the beginning. Ken mentioned that there's been sort of a fraught bilateral relationship between the United States and India for many, many years, and I think we've all experienced that. So what brought the two sides together to begin with? And maybe some people were surprised at the beginning of this year that there was all this ambition between the two presidents of the two countries. What caused this turnaround in terms of a decision to try to do something ambitious from a trade perspective? Mark, you want to take a crack at that?
Sure. Since I guess I've branded myself as a U.S.-India trade guy since the last position I held at USTR some years ago. And I should note, and I expect Don and Sharon would share this perspective. Multilateral is a lot worse than bilateral with India. In fact, we discussed this during the Friday exchange we had on WTO issues. But the short answer is tariffs and the threat of tariffs. I mean, that is what made the difference at the very start of this administration. I think the Indian side was very savvy. Prime Minister was savvy, coming to Washington almost immediately after the inauguration in February. The two leaders did a joint statement, which was very ambitious on trade, much more ambitious, for example, than the joint statement with Japan, kind of contemporaneously. It called for a comprehensive bilateral trade agreement covering goods, services, non-tariff barriers, tariffs, basically the whole gamut. And I've noted a lot that while legally this is not an FTA, not being characterized as an FTA, the scope initially appeared to be a hell of a lot like an FTA. So, I think the Indians wanted to avoid tariffs as much as possible. They understand how much they rely on the U.S. market. It is their largest export market, and the strategic relationship was and remains important. Now, things have changed a lot over the last few months, and I was one of those predicting confidently there was going to be a trade agreement even as early as mid-July, and I got that really wrong. But it was really a series of intervening events that weren't trade related that I think set back the negotiations for a bilateral deal related to the conflict between India and Pakistan, and the president wanting credit for a ceasefire there, and Prime Minister Modi not offering that credit. And then, the situation with the purchases of Russian oil, I think it just kind of added on to that. But hopefully things are back on track. It's been, as is customary with the United States and India, a rocky road. It's always going to be a bit of a rocky road, but the trajectory again looks up. I'm no longer making predictions, but I think that there's a real prospect again for a significant agreement.
Okay, if I could. Sorry, I was just going to say, when Mark was making the optimistic predictions, and Mark, I think we wanted you to be right on this, but around that time, Wendy Cutler, one of our other colleagues, had made a post just noting that for those of us who have been USTR trade negotiators, we approach this with some skepticism, given what you mentioned, Joe, kind of this long history of challenges in negotiating with India. And one of the challenges I think that it's helpful to understand is India's position as being non-aligned with other countries. And this has been something that goes back to the 1940s and partition and their independence. And realistically, that's not really that long ago. All of us have worked with folks who at least remember that time, were kids during that time. And it's kind of deep-seated that India, for many reasons, does not want to be too closely aligned to the United States, to Russia, to China. And this makes it challenging in the WTO when India is also acting in a very non-aligned way, not necessarily forming coalitions and doing their own thing, and sometimes being very isolated, but because of WTO rules, able to upend the apple cart by being non-aligned and on their own.
Sharon, do you want to add?
No, I was just going to maybe go further back than where Mark started, and go back to, I don't know, what was it? 2000, I don't know, before the pandemic, when we were all there, and the tariff playbook is what Trump 1 used, right? They withdrew GSP preference from India, and that brought India to the table. I know in agriculture, which is always tough in India, I mean, we made progress in negotiations on all but maybe the most important, politically important issue, but we were making progress on a lot of ag issues as a part of those negotiations before they blew up over other reasons.
That's interesting. So there was a track record on this that the Trump administration had, and in the event, Modi proved to be pragmatic about all this, because I think we're all. I wasn't as involved in the WTO as recently as you all, except with one exception, which is I was in the biopharmaceutical industry and when the TRIPS waiver issue came up, and India was the great antagonist on that, except that we didn't quite understand it because it wasn't really clear what they, the short-term benefit to all of it, except that they were leading this pack, with South Africa. And the U.S. was actually, the U.S. was kind of in the middle, but Europe was on the other side. The other developed countries were on the other side. And, some of us may have thought that India would come out swinging a bit like China did on this, like how dare, because this is kind of India's posture a lot in the multilateral setting. How dare you tell us, big industrialized imperialist country. But in the event that, so I was maybe a little surprised at how Modi was so pragmatic. I also wonder if there's just if Trump and Modi are just to a certain extent simpatico with each other on a personal level, if that had something to do with it. Mark, do you think?
Well, I think the distinction again goes back to multilateral versus WTO. Versus bilateral. You name the issue. Our two countries are always on opposite sides, whether it's agriculture and public stock holding, or trips and public health, or the e-commerce moratorium, where in fact India should have some shared interests, special and differential treatment, fishery subsidies. Every single issue, and that's not changed up until now. That's, the multilateral still remains not good between the two countries. It's less relevant now because the multilateral trading system is less relevant now. But bilaterally, it has been different. And Don and I talked about this quite a bit during the session on what's happening in the WTO and contrasting bilateral versus multilateral. There's the ability to get more traction, and tariffs provide leverage. So Sharon, referred to that earlier situation during Trump 1.0. Both Sharon and I were working together. I was in the early part of that and then left USTR. Sharon continued to do yeoman's work on agriculture. It eventually collapsed, but it was pulling India's benefits under the GSP program, which is a tariff preferential program. So, I think Modi is pragmatic, but what happened this time around, and I think they could have done a trade deal earlier than now, was an unexpected event, the terrorist attack in Pahalgam, and the brief period of things going kinetic between Pakistan and India. If that had not happened, it may have been a different situation in striking a trade deal. So we'll see how things play out now.
Well, let's unpack the negotiations a little bit then. What do we know about what the key issues are and how close or far apart they were? Were they first of all, what were the key issues? We know what in general the issues are. You've got tariffs on manufactured goods, industrialized goods. You've got a panoply of agricultural issues. You've got things like digital issues, maybe some IP issues. What do we know about what the sticking points were and how close they really were, or how far apart they really were? Anybody want to take
on?
I'll start with just a range of issues, and then ag, obviously. So Sharon, can really dial in on agriculture. There are a lot of sensitivities on the Indian side in agriculture, and getting to that sweet spot is challenging. I think there's some appreciation on, at least at USTR, of some of the challenges India faces on agriculture. Maybe not a lot of sympathy, but some understanding of the challenges to getting to yes on agriculture. But I think generally it's the same issues that almost every single country has had to deal with in negotiating with the Trump administration. It's, how low will you go with your tariffs? The EU agreed to 0 tariffs on all industrial goods. Shocking. Truly shocking. And I think the expectation is the same for India. Can India do that? Can it get agreement on transitions? What's the reciprocal tariff that applies? It's not going to be 10%. It may only be as low as 15%. So, what's the trade-off? And what about the 232s? I mean, what kind of security is there going forward in these trade agreements on new actions, tariff actions on 232? So I don't know that India's in that unique of, every country has its unique issues, but I think almost every country negotiating with the Trump administration has kind of confronted this range of issues and trying to strike it.
Are you saying that you don't really think the talk, again, you're distinguishing between bilateral and multilateral, but in a sense, you're saying that the negotiations with India were not necessarily that much different in difficulty, or much higher in difficity than other bilateral
India's always the hardest, but, well, I mean, the European Union is pretty damn hard. But I think there were intervening events that were, in some respects, more relevant to not getting a deal a couple of months ago than the issues that were on the table. But they're negotiating again, and I think they're making progress on those issues.
Sharon, what about the agriculture? I mean, how much daylight was between the two sides, and what do you think?
Well, a lot of the agriculture issues comes down to level of ambition. And if people know anything about U.S. agriculture, U.S. ags, when they're looking at deals on opening up export markets, are extremely high ambition. And yet countries all over the world, including the United States, and particularly India, are very protectionist for their farmers. I think there is a unique aspect of India in agriculture, where you've got something like 93 million households in agriculture that are tied to agriculture, and 82% of that is small and marginal farmers. In other words, they're poor. They don't have the big machinery that we necessarily have in the United States. Compare that 93 million to the number of U.S. farmers, which is well under 2 million. So there's huge differences in the agriculture and how they, and I know Dawn has seen some of that in person, and she may want to elaborate. But we have the same issues on agriculture as we did, not even in the late 2010s, but when Obama went over, I think it was in 2010, he was raising dairy. Dairy is still going to be a huge issue. And part of it is what we would call a non-tariff barrier, where India requires that the animals be fed a certain kind of feed, and that's not how we grow or feed our animals. Ethanol has always been a big issue, and there India is largely protecting a lot of its sugar producers for the sugar that goes into ethanol. We grow a lot of products from seeds that are developed through biotechnology. India has had huge problems since the mid-90s from a lot of the NGOs in opposition to using biotechnology for a number of reasons, valid or not. So there's a real opposition to even, sending genetically engineered hay in for animal feed. We did make a lot of progress. I think one of the unique things I found about negotiating with India, right? We would deal with the Ministry of Commerce, and we would have great discussions there in Delhi and getting a lot of nodding of heads and, oh, that sounds good. Yes, I think we can do that. We go back 4 months later and they've consulted with their ag ministry, and it's like, nope, 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 nope. Right. So you never knew who you were negotiating with. You never had a sense that, yeah, we actually were going to nail it, because we didn't know what the opposition would be elsewhere.
And just, I would say, the comment earlier, I think Mark made it about there weren't many details in the Japan agreement, but there was more details about like what we were discussing on India. You saw a similar situation with Indonesia, a lot of detail in that draft or the press release that came out about what we were going to be discussing. And I think that reflects in some respects the level of difficulty that we have with the countries. We don't have as many bilateral irritants with Japan as we do with a country like India or Indonesia. And of course, if you look at the national trade estimate and you see the length, and I will say the EU probably has the longest, so I don't want to single out India necessarily, but Indonesia, India both have extremely long entries in the NT because of the large number of challenging issues that we have. Sharon's spoken about agriculture. Joe, I'm sure you can talk at length about the intellectual property challenges. On the NTB's side, when you think of it beyond SPS, the TBTs, the technical barriers to trade, India has these quality control orders requiring local testing of products. I know some of Mark's colleagues at the Atlantic Council have put out some interesting ideas on maybe how the U.S. could propose overcoming some of these local testing requirements and maybe not applying them to the U.S. Because, of course, this is not supposed to be permitted under the TBT agreement when you're supposed to recognize the test results of other countries' labs, for example. But this is a great cost to have. I mean, if a small company has to test in multiple markets their product, it's kind of it inhibits exports from happening. I was way back in my career, I was douster for India for 3 years. I traveled there extensively. And I did get to see a lot of the poverty on the ground of seeing the farmers out in the fields. They don't use tractors a lot of the time because it's a jobs program. I mean, Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think, are they not the most populous country in the world right now? Mm-hmm. And they are trying to create jobs for all of their citizens. And this was a huge issue on customs as well. They were reluctant to implement fully single window programs at the ports because it would take away jobs, and they needed those jobs for the massive amount of people that they have in the country. So understanding those situations while also, it's hard not to know that India is a country of significant wealth as well. And you go to a place like Bangalore and you feel like you've landed in Silicon Valley. And you go to Bollywood. And I mean, one of the largest digital content producers in the world. And this is why we say it's counterintuitive that India is against the e-commerce moratorium when they have so much digital content. They make most of the cartoons for the global market in India, which would be negatively affected by duties on digital transmissions going into effect. But as Sharon mentioned, the agriculture ministry is so powerful. And in working with India, it's very important to understand the power position of some of the ministries. Agriculture is right up there, very close to Modi. You look at the people that are in power there, they're going to be tied to the BJP very closely, and also the finance ministry. And even though Piyush Goyal is a key player, he has other ministries that he's working with that are in a different power position from where he is.
Yeah, the only thing I would respond to on that is that, in fact, I have found over time, and this is in the last 10 years or so, that in fact, I think in some respects, the two Trump administrations and the focus on trade and the threats and imposition of tariffs have ironically empowered the Ministry of Commerce and Industry more than it was before Trump was in office, because the stakes have been so high for India, the trade relationship. And whereas, going back to the Obama administration and before, the Ministry of Commerce and Industry would get nowhere, I think, because that's really before I was working with India bilaterally in corralling some of these ministries. Over time, the Ministry of Commerce and Industry has been given some leash by the Prime Minister to bring those ministries to the table, because it's been so important to try to resolve tariff issues. I mean, it's not like USTR. Well, we all know from our experience, USTR by law coordinates among all of the U.S. government departments involved in trade, but it's never easy trying to corral those agencies. India, obviously, as Don lays out, has a more difficult time. It doesn't have a statutory authority to do all this. But, I think in recent years, it's been given more power to bring those ministries to the table. But when a trade deal doesn't get done, then they kind of lose that leverage with the other ministries. I mean, I think this most recent situation, I've heard concerns that the ministries are saying, "Well, forget you. You have failed in getting a trade agreement with the United States, so we're not going to play ball anymore." So it is a delicate dance, I think, as Don pointed out.
And a lot of these non-tariff measures are really the purview of other ministries. Tariffs are the purview often of the Commerce Ministry or of Treasury or Finance, but you've got all these different non-tariff measures, and I want to come talk a little bit about that point because Don, you mentioned that early in the year, our friend Wendy Cutler was one of the more, say, skeptical or wary of an agreement, and you mentioned the long chapter that's in the NTE report, and let me put those two facts together with the fact that it takes time to work these, a trade agreement. A big trade agreement, an ambitious trade agreement. I negotiated the bilateral trade agreement with Vietnam. It took 5 years. Okay, this was way back when Vietnam was a total newcomer to the world system. So maybe that's too long. But the idea that when I was hearing this anyway, in February, that you were going to have this done by the summertime or something like that, knowing the agenda that was out there with India, it was kind of hard to imagine that you could get into the detail of these issues, which you need to do, as you all know, as negotiate, and that the Ministry of Commerce could corral all of these ministries effectively. So, but apparently they did make some progress. So, what's your sense of that? Did they actually get into? So let me turn this into a question. Did they actually? We've all seen some of these frameworks with other countries. Some were quite general. Even the Indonesian document, which you referenced, Don, I read that. It was a couple pages long, 2 or 3 pages. But if you're really looking for the detail, that wasn't there. And was USTR and the U.S. government really getting into the meat, the nitty gritty of these trade issues with India as they were putting this negotiation together? And do you think that they could have done that in the time period that they had?
So if I understand your question right, and maybe I'll start with agriculture, you mean the one that's been the negotiations that have been on and off this year, right? Yeah. And right, so there's a little bit of lack of public information because, if this were truly a true comprehensive bilateral trade deal under Trade Promotion Authority, there would have been, negotiating objectives released and, various public facing documents coming out of the US. I don't know what India does, and we haven't seen any of that. That being said, I know in the case of agriculture, they are dealing with these nitty gritty ag trade barriers because, as well as the tariff issues, because India has some of the highest ag tariffs of any country. So I know they are getting into it. I don't know how much real progress. I suspect that the long-standing problems that we've had for decades are continuing to be long-standing problems with difficulty in making progress.
And I think it's important to understand just briefly that it's not like we were starting from scratch earlier this year. Of course, we have had the trade policy forum with India for several years, but there are a number of bilateral channels. Of course, we have the embassy in Delhi that is constantly, the econ counselors are constantly engaging. We had, when I was at Commerce Department, my team had a monthly call with the commercial counselors in Delhi to continue to engage the Indian government on the quality control orders, for example. And we did feel like we were making some small incremental progress in working with the different regulators on those issues. So it's this constant ongoing discussion with India on these issues, and the negotiations themselves and the tariff threat, as Mark pointed out, is the leverage that we were lacking, I would say, before earlier this year.
Yeah, and just to add to that, well, first, the aspiration between the two, assuming that's still in place, a lot of time, well, not so much time, but a lot has happened since February when the two leaders met in Washington. They issued this joint statement for a comprehensive bilateral trade agreement. The plan was always phase it, do a first agreement that deals with the reciprocal tariffs and then continue negotiations building on that, getting into rules areas like TBT, like SPS, like even government procurement. I think that is in the mix, but way down and intellectual property rights, way down the road. So, the objective, and I think it still is the objective, is to do a first deal and build on that. And, I think it's getting to ag and agriculture, and what Sharon was highlighting. I mean, look at those agreements with Japan and with the EU. So, I think India would like to get that 15% rate that both Japan and the EU got. Korea got too, but that agreement may be unraveling as we speak. But with the EU, there's a far-reaching joint statement on industrial tariffs, but on agriculture, it just identifies a number of commodities where it says the EU, they'll work towards the EU giving preferential treatment to the United States. It's not really a deal on those sectors. Japan is the best example with rice, where they are just rejiggering a global tariff rate quota they have. They're not opening their market anymore. They're just planning to take some of the access that other countries have to the Japanese market on rice and giving it to the United States. So it's pretty limited in terms of the concessions made by those two countries so far on agriculture.
And that kind of goes to the point that Don made. I want to ask this question too. I mean, India does have hundreds of millions, right? Farmers, small villages,
millions.
Yeah. Europe and Japan don't, but agriculture issues are still very, very difficult with Europe.
Well, yeah, but Joe, in Japan and the UK and the EU, their farmers are just as vocal as in India. Yes, we can all remember just a couple of 2-3 years ago, the huge protests in India over minor changes to their farm support programs that actually the US would have welcomed. Huge protests. Well, you had huge protests in Europe too, with what was happening to their common agricultural policy as well. So farmers in all the countries are particularly very politically important to the politicians.
Yeah. And it just seems that, my sense, and maybe this is, Sharon, if you think it's an overstatement, correct me, but EU and Japan were largely successful at getting those issues kind of off the table in this negotiation.
Well, but they didn't really get anything, Joe. All right. Yes, we get on rice. Rice, we're getting some more rice into Japan, but Japan's not changing its market, its structure, its TRQ. EU, well, it remains to be seen. Yes, I know that the legislation has gone to the EU Parliament to eliminate some of those tariffs and to increase some TRQs for almonds and for some other things. We haven't seen whether the Parliament will approve it. But you still had, and the EU was upfront saying this early, we're not going to change any of our food safety, plant health, animal issues. That's off the table, right?
Right.
Just as in the UK. The UK, yes, we got really important new ethanol market access into the UK. But the UK then says, well, we're going to, increase access for beef. Well, the UK still has huge animal health and food safety barriers. How we're not going to be shipping a lot of beef to the UK. So, it's really, you need the marrying of both the non-tariff barriers and the tariff, particularly with India, because their tariffs are so high, to be able to actually get real agricultural market access. And I'm just going to say our agriculture industry is hurting big time, and we need to be expanding our export markets ASAP so that they aren't going bankrupt.
Do you think that did India, as you said, you were the one that said this, Sharon, we really don't have a lot of inside information, even though we're ex-negotiators. I think we should assure the world we don't have any special information.
Right.
Generally speaking, we may hear more rumors than the average person, but I'm not sure how much hard information we have. But the fact that Europe and Japan were successful, did that empower India? Did that help India? Was India able to point to that in the negotiations, do you think, to say, wait a minute, you didn't make them walk the line on ag. So
I sure hope. I would think so, right? Every country's looking at what every other country is doing, and they're all probably talking to each other. How do we negotiate with the U.S.?
Yeah.
And Joe, on that point too, I mean, you, Wendy, Dan, and I were talking about this a bit last week, in terms of what's in these deals, and I think Wendy made the comment about, we were talking about like political costs, for the Trump administration continuing to maintain high tariffs, and that eventually having some economic impacts perhaps down the road. But I think Wendy made a comment about, there are these big numbers that get announced and then lots of exceptions that are kind of behind the scenes or not as much, aren't publicized as much by the administration, that limits the impacts of the tariffs. And, I think there's kind of a parallel situation where the president himself announces these trade deals as like opening up all trade, when in fact that is not happening at all. I mean, they've used the leverage effectively in getting some trade deals and getting some reductions in tariffs on industrial goods, but these are not comprehensive agreements at all. So it's they're announcing more than what they're actually getting. And who knows what's happening with Vietnam? You highlighted Vietnam. There's not as far as I understand, a single piece of paper. And I know we're focused on India, but just, to give a sense of the broader perspective with this administration's trade policy, there is not a piece of paper yet for Vietnam. And it was one of the first agreements.
They were a first mover, but you're absolutely right about that. There wasn't. And I think you make a good point too, Mark, which is that, and Sharon, I think it's probably more true in agriculture maybe than a lot of other places, where to really get at market access, you've got to peel this onion of tariffs, non-tariff measures. And if you don't take care of all of it, you're not going to get true market access, or there's going to be impediments of it. So to say that, India did this or that, or another country did this or that, does not necessarily equate to the market being open to U.S. exporters. And I think this is something we all agree with, right? These things are there's just a lot of detail, and it's playing whack-a-mole a lot of times with the other countries.
Well, let's be clear, all administrations do it, right? We have all been the ones writing the talking points for the White House, so saying, and Biden did it, we're lowering the tariff on, India's lowering the tariff on pecans. Yeah, lowering it from like 100% to what, 30 or 40%? We're still not shipping pecans.
Not going to get market access.
It's not going to have market access. So everybody, we're all trying to make it sound good. It's
going to be interesting too to see. What if we do get a deal with India? What's going to be in it at the end of the day? Because I do, one thing we haven't talked about, and I know we don't have time for a full-blown discussion on this, but we are 6 months away from the next WTO ministerial, and it was interesting in the Indonesia document that the e-commerce moratorium was mentioned. And given that it is, I will say Indonesia is the largest antagonist on that issue because they had the tariffs ready to go. But India was right there too. And my understanding, from the last WTO ministerial, it was India was the very last one standing on this issue. So will they be, will the US be able to get that into an India agreement as well and preempt, what could happen 6 months from now? Because 6 months in WTO terms is like the blink of an eye.
Well, that's a good question. Dawn, in the time we have left, I want to segue off of what you said, maybe give you the first chance to respond to this, which is, okay, let's prognosticate now. Secretary of Commerce and Industry Goyal was here a few weeks ago, late September. I guess the mood, tone was more positive, I think, for both sides. And so it's a double part question, sort of, do you think they'll reach an agreement say by the end of the year? And secondly, what kind of an agreement is it going to be? How detailed? How can they, what do you think it will be? Mark, you mentioned maybe it'll be a stepping stone to something even further, which kind of makes sense because these trade issues never disappear. You're never going to get rid of all of them. But Dawn, what's your prediction?
My prediction is that there will be some type of an announcement by the end of the year that says there's been some kind of progress, but that there won't be a lot of details associated with that.
So maybe like just a joint statement or something like that.
Something to kind of tide us over. I just watching the various FTA negotiations that India has done over the years, nothing ends quickly. And I just can't see this one ending quickly either. But just given, as Mark has rightly pointed out, the bigger geopolitical issues that are going on, that there needs to be some type of stabilization of the broader relationship with India. So I could see some type of announcement, but not a trade deal.
And in the meantime, the 50% tariffs are there.
For now, unless they can get some type of interim relief.
I don't think there will be an announcement unless the 50% goes down. And I'm pretty confident that will happen by the end of the year.
You think it'll be the Russian oil tariffs that are taken off or something else? Or
I think that, and I think there's a decent chance that the reciprocal tariff, which is now at 25%, goes down a bit, maybe not to 15, but maybe to 20. And Don raises a really good point about, I think they might go further than that. We might actually see more in substance by the end of the year, some form of agreement. But to Don's point about an announcement, one of the wild cards is that the president likes to announce deals, and often he does it prematurely. And we could have that kind of situation where USTR is doing the yeoman's work. They are negotiating hard on specific issues. They're making some progress. They have more work to do, but the president doesn't want to give them more time for that. He wants an announcement sooner than that. So, I could see that kind of scenario where, he either posts on Truth Social that we've got a deal when in fact there's not much that's nailed down in that deal. But I will say there are still rumors that Prime Minister Modi and President Trump will meet by the end of the year, which would be kind of a big impetus to do more rather than less. But that's a bit of wild card along the lines of what Don was highlighting.
When's the next time that we know that Modi will see Trump?
I don't think we know anything, but I keep hearing rumors. We've got events coming up. We've got, the ASEAN leaders in KL. We've got the APEC leaders in Korea. There's still, talk, and it's been delayed at least. Of a Quad leaders meeting in Delhi. Those are all possibilities, but I sense that there are more rumors circulating around those possibilities than, kind of a real chance of that happening.
Okay. Sharon, I'm not going to let you off the hook. Would you venture to take a guess of what happens by the end of this year?
I'm not going to disagree with Dawn and Mark because I respect them a lot. I'm just going to say if it happens, there better be something actually that's meaningful for U.S. ag because our farmers are hurting.
Totally.
Yeah, and they'll notice it, right? If there isn't.
Yep.
And going back to I think something Don said, 1.4 billion people, and China not buying soybeans, and there's so much at stake with India on agriculture.
Yeah. So that's kind of that could be. It sounds like what you're saying is that could be in some sense a decisive issue. Like, could there be an agreement without agriculture, without something meaningful on agriculture?
That would be a mistake.
That would be a mistake. Yeah.
Totally.
Let's leave it at that. Anybody want to get the final word in? I noticed that as moderator, I don't have to make a prediction. I think that's the best.
Yeah, there you
position.
go.
So I think you're all in the general vicinity.
One prediction I will make, going back to where we started, multilateral. My prediction would be no results at the next ministerial conference.
14. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe it'll get postponed.
They may have to. That's better than a failed ministerial.
It's been done before.
Yeah, Don, I think, had to endure Buenos Aires during the first Trump administration. So
I actually had a baby to get out of having to go to Buenos Aires, remember? I went to great lengths to not go to that ministerial.
Good for you. The lengths people will go to. By the way, we should extend a word of empathy maybe to our colleagues at USTR, who I believe a number of them have been exempted from this government shutdown.
All of them, I think.
All of them haven't. Thought it was partial. Okay, so they are now deemed so essential.
They're just not getting paid.
They're just not getting paid. Well, let's hope that that's rectified. Well, thank you, everybody. And just to conclude, this is Joe DeMond, and thank you for joining us all today. We'll see you next week on WITA's Friday Exchange.
Welcome to WITA's Friday Exchange, a media product of the Washington International Trade Association. Each week, we bring you inside the room with former trade negotiators and policy insiders to unpack the latest in trade and tariff developments, what's been announced, what's at stake, and what might come next. Imagine our speakers are sitting at a local pub after a tough week at the office or at the negotiating table, downloading with their colleagues about the latest developments in international trade. That's what we aim to bring you with WITA's Friday Exchange. New episodes drop every Friday. Subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify to be the first to know when they go live.